So, I'm currently locked in my room and I don't know what to do. I'll give you all some background before I dive right into what's been happening. I'm currently living in, let's just say, a large city in the UK. I've just moved here to study and rent is super expensive. So I decided to rent a room from a landlady. She's Chinese, she's really kind, and there are 3 other tenants living in the house. So far, it's been pretty ideal. She works long hours, so she's barely here, and the house is always very quiet, which is the perfect atmosphere for studying. The only major drawback is that I have to ask her permission before I have people over, and we can't have house parties. But I'm a mature student, so I don't really care about that. I've been living here for about 4 months now, and everything has been absolutely fine. So fast forward to tonight. The weather where I live has been pretty stormy recently. It's past midnight, I can hear the wind howling, and there's a downpour going on outside. About 3 hours ago, I suddenly remembered that my boyfriend was going to be coming over next week. I went to knock on my landlady's door and asked for permission, but no one answered and I saw no light under the door. I decided to text her saying, "Hello, sorry to bother you. I was wondering whether it would be alright for my boyfriend to come over next Tuesday and stay overnight until Wednesday." After a couple of minutes, she replied with, "Of course, no problem." It suddenly dawned on me that it was already 9 p.m. and my landlady was normally back from work by 7 p.m. at the latest. She drives out of the city for work, and with the inclement weather conditions, I became quite worried about her. I texted her again saying, "Thank you. Are you alright? Is there a lot of traffic because of the rain?" I didn't get a response immediately, so I went back to doing my reading for my classes next week. About an hour later, at approx 10 p.m., I finally got a response. It had been so long that the sound of my phone really startled me. This is where it starts to get weird. The message from my landlady read, "Don't worry, I'm fine. I was in an accident and now I'm dead." Understandably, this freaked me out, but English isn't my landlady's first language and she's made worst spelling mistakes before. So I wasn't too concerned. The wind, however, was getting louder and the rain more fierce. I was really concerned that she might be hurt and even contemplated calling the police. I replied immediately saying, "I'm so sorry to hear that. Was it a bad accident? Where are you? Are you staying in a hotel tonight?" This time she replied very quickly and the message read, "No, tonight I sleep next to you." Again, this struck to me as quite strange. But our rooms are next door to one another, so I thought that might be what she meant. That being said, her English wasn't normally this bad. I decided I would leave it and go back to doing my reading. Within about 10 minutes, my phone went off again and there was another message. It was in Chinese, so it took a lot of wrangling with Google to finally decipher it. But this is what I think it says. When I wrote it in Google Translate, the translation came back saying, "I'm so hungry." I assumed that she had meant to send this text to one of her Chinese friends, but had sent it to me by accident. Perhaps she was out in cold and wet, waiting for a recovery van for her broken down car, complaining to her friend, and she wanted to go home and eat dinner. It all still seemed relatively innocuous, so I decided to write back saying, "Sorry, I don't really understand what that means. Did you mean to send that to another friend? Are you alright?" At that point, she tried calling me, but for some reason the thought of answering that call sent chills down my spine. After all, the whistle of the wind, the oppressive dark outside my window, the crash of raindrops against the glass, it was all quite creepy. Not to mention the weird way in which she'd been speaking. Eventually the call rang off, but it was immediately followed by a message which read, "My name." After more fumbling with Google Translate, I discovered this meant, "You make me very angry." The presence of my name at the start of the message assured me that this time it was definitely intended for me, even though my landlady knows I can't read or speak Chinese. My landlady is really sweet and docile older lady, so I was quite surprised that she would say something so openly aggressive. I just sent her a quick message saying, "I'm sorry if I upset you. I hope you make it home safely." She didn't respond, and feeling a tad shook up, I eventually went back to my reading. After a while, I calmed down and realized it was probably all mixed up. I did, however, become more concerned that my landlady still hadn't shown up. So, just before midnight, when I heard the familiar creak of the front gate, I was actually quite relieved. I nearly poked my head out of the door to greet my landlady, but decided that might be a bit weird. I heard the key in the lock, the slam of the door, the footsteps slowly creeping up the stairs. But what I heard next made my blood run cold. My landlady stood directly outside my bedroom door and began whispering something that sounded like, "Wo how, air," occasionally getting louder and more frenetic, then reverting back to the calm but persistent whisper. I could hear her fingernails scratching slowly but purposefully on the wood. I immediately ran to the door and locked it. I've never been more thankful to have a bedroom door with an individual lock. As soon as she heard the lock go, she let out this horrifying wail and started beating on the door. I was genuinely so terrified that I just curled up on my bed and sat paralyzed, staring at the door. After what felt like a century, she stopped banging, and I haven't heard from her since. I've managed to gain my composure, but I haven't contacted anyone yet. What should I do? Should I leave my room? Should I contact the police? I want to leave the room, but I'm afraid she might be out there. It's past midnight now, and I don't know what to do. Please help. Needless to say, the situation has only gotten creepier. The night I wrote the message, I had been working pretty much non-stop all day on assignments. Even though what happened with my landlady and utterly freaked me out, I ended up lying down on the bed and pretty much passed out not long after writing my posts. I was so exhausted that I didn't even turn out the light. Honestly, I'm amazed I was able to sleep for so long. The next morning, I woke up feeling pretty groggy, and I got to make my coffee. It was so out of it that I didn't remember what had happened until I went to open the door and realized it was locked. I must have been feeling brave because I opened the door and went downstairs. I noticed my landlady's door was closed and the coast was clear, so I went and made coffee as normal. I figured maybe I dreamt the whole thing, or at the very least that it hadn't been as bad as I remembered. I made coffee, got ready for class, and left the house on Friday morning. As I walked out, I noticed that my landlady's car wasn't parked outside, so I assumed she had gone to work as normal, and I felt relieved. I was totally freaking wrong. I came back from classes around 5 p.m., went out to get some groceries, then came to do some work in my room. At about 7 p.m., I was just flat out overcome with hunger, so I got up to make dinner. As I opened my door, I looked straight at my landlady's door and immediately stopped in my tracks. Her door was open, just a crack, and she was standing in the opening just staring at me. All of the lights in her room were off and her face was obscured by the darkness, but I could tell there was something wrong. I know this sounds insane, but it looked as though her lips and nose were missing. Like the bottom half of her face was just one huge cleft palate with red open flesh marked by the whiteness of her bare teeth. She kept alternately eyeing me and threshold to my room. She was breathing heavily and making these grotesque guttural sounds as if she was choking on water. My room was fully lit. but without the hall light on, it was actually quite dark in the hallway. I had my mobile phone in hand, but that was it. Without even thinking, I just made a break for it. Blood rushed to my head and heart. My heart was pounding. I could hear her door open, could feel the vibrations as she literally thundered after me down the hall. When I made it to the bottom of the stairs, I noticed that her heavy footsteps had stopped. She must have stopped at the top of the stairs. The downstairs hallway light was on, and I feel like this may be somehow connected. Either way, I didn't dare to look back. I shot out of the house and just kept running until I made it to the nearest cafe. I was barefoot, had no money, and my mobile was rapidly running out of the battery. Fortunately, I was able to get through to my boyfriend, who I had already spoken about the situation. He came to pick me up, and I stayed over at his house Friday night. After I got back to his, I was feeling so shook up that I could barely move. But eventually he calmed me down and convinced me to call the police. I also contacted my other housemates, but one of them is currently back home in New Zealand. One of them still hasn't responded, and one of them didn't really understand what I was saying, as English isn't his first language. When I mentioned my landlady's name to the police, I noticed a sudden change in the dispatcher's tone. She told me to wait and that they would be back in touch, but I didn't hear from them again until today. This is where it starts to get really strange. So another police officer, this time a man, called me back and asked me to confirm my landlady's name and our address. He paused for a long time and then finally he told me that the woman I'd encountered in my house couldn't possibly have been my landlady. My landlady was killed in a hit-and-run accident on Thursday night. I was dumbstruck. I asked them why the police hadn't contacted me, but it turns out all of us have been living in the house illegally. We'd been paying her cash in hand, so I had my suspicions, and they had no idea there was anyone else living in the house. Apparently, they were able to identify her based on her name badge, which she was wearing at the time of accident. However, as despicable as this sounds, the police officer told me that her corpse had been robbed before they'd found it. Her mobile phone, wallet, keys, everything, but her clothes on her back had been taken. He said it was highly possible that whoever had her mobile phone was the one sending those text messages to mess with me, and they probably used the ID on her wallet to figure out her address before coming to rob the house. At first, this sort of made sense, but then I told him about the messages that were in Chinese. How would some random thief know how to write fluent Chinese? The police officer's only answer to that was they'd been doing the same way I had, by using a translator. I then broached the subject of the creepy whispering and how disfigured the person that had chased me looked. He said he believed it might be a homeless person potentially injured and suffering from a mental illness. But then I asked how a homeless person could possibly get from the scene of the crime to our address over 30 minutes drive away in such a short space of time. It all just doesn't add up. If you are going to rob a corpse, why would you go to their house and stay there overnight? And why harass people connected to the victim? I asked him if anyone else had come forward in connection to my landlady, and he told me I was the first. After a lengthy discussion, he told me he wanted to meet me in person to try and get some information about next of kin, but first he was going to send some officers to our address. He told me to sit tight at my boyfriend's house and wait until he called me back. I've informed my university to let them know they've given me some leeway with regards to assignments and classes this week. All of this happened around 5 p.m. today, and I was starting to feel much better about the situation. I was going to head to bed when I received this text message from my landlady. I think I've managed to type it into Google Translate correctly, but all it says is, "Thank you for asking me to eat." I don't get why she's still talking about food. Is there something I'm missing here? Maybe she's some homeless person who's stolen my landlady's phone and is trying to trick me. But why does she keep using Chinese? What should I do? Should I respond to the message or phone the police and let them know? I'm still at my boyfriend's house at the moment, and I've finally heard from one of my housemates. My main concern swiftly switched to my housemates since I had discovered our landlady had passed away and we had been living in our house illegally. I spoke with the officer briefly about it, and he said that since we'd paid for the month, we'd be permitted to stay in the house until the end of the month. But then we'd had to collect our stuff and find somewhere else to go. Today I updated my housemates on the situation. But up until midday, I had only heard back from one who's back in New Zealand with his family. He's obviously feeling quite shell-shocked, and I told him I was categorically not going back to the house until I heard from the police. But I said that I could arrange to have his stuff picked up once we get the all clear to save him cutting his family visit short. I still hadn't back from one housemate at this point, an 18-year-old kid who, from what I gathered, was kicked out by his parents and was living in the smallest room in the house, but I did hear from the other housemate today at around 5 p.m. My other housemate is originally from Poland, so his English is okay but not brilliant. When I first mentioned what had happened to him, he didn't really seem to understand, and all he could really grasp was that our landlady had been in an accident. I wasn't sure whether this was because he didn't understand my message or because it was just too unbelievable for him. Anyway, he called me at about 5 p.m. and told me that after receiving my message on Friday night, he had decided to go stay at his sister's flat. She lives in the west of the city, and discuss with her about finding a new place to live. It turns out he knew that we were living there illegally, and he was concerned that he might be implicated in some way. He decided to return to the house today to pick up some of his belongings, and that's when I got the call from him. When he was on the phone, I could hear his unholy din in the background, and I asked him what was going on. His room is directly below our landlady's, and he said the noise was coming from above. Apparently, whoever is up there had been scrabbling around, making these erratic thumping noises and scratching sounds intermittently since he's up there. At the point when he called me, he'd locked his door and was too scared to leave the room. I felt so guilty, wondering whether I should have been firmer with my warnings and telling him categorically not to go back to the house in my previous message. His room has a window that looks out on the road, so I asked him to see if there was a police car outside. He looked for quite a while and said there was a police car parked on the road, but it was quite far from the house and could be dealing with something further up the road. At this point, I was pretty livid since the police officer I spoke to on Saturday had assured me that officers would be sent to the house Saturday night. I told my housemate that I'd call the police and get back to him as soon as possible. I could hear the noise upstairs getting louder, and it sounded as though my housemate was on the verge of tears at this stage. My heart sunk and I felt awful hanging up on them. Just as I was about to call the police, I received a text message from my landlady saying, "I've become pretty adept at writing Chinese characters into Google Translate now." And this translation was pretty clear. It says, "Come." With my housemate still trapped in his room, I knew immediately that this must be some sort of threat. I phoned the police and gave them all the details about the situation, including the name of the officer I spoke to. But all the dispatcher told me was that they would call me back. I begged them to tell me what had happened with the officers they sent to the house, if they ever sent any at all, and sent some officers to the house now to help my housemate. But she said that she couldn't disclose any information about the case without the officer's permission, and that she'd take my housemate's mobile number to confirm what was happening. I felt completely helpless. I phoned my housemate back to tell them what had happened, but by this point the noise upstairs was so loud that I could barely hear him, and he was literally weeping down the phone. All I could hear him say was my name, "I'm gonna die. She's gonna kill me, please, please," over and over again. I know this sounds incredibly rash, but I couldn't just leave him there. I explained the situation to my boyfriend, and against my better judgment, we drove back to the house. It was about half-hour drive, and that in time I practically chewed my nails down to the bed. The only weapons we had with us were kitchen knife from my boyfriend's house, a large flashlight and a cricket bat from one of his housemates. When I opened that door, I felt my heart jump into my throat. The light bulb must have burnt out because the downstairs hallway was now completely bathed in darkness. Immediately to my left, I could see my housemate's door was wide open. It looked like it had been literally torn open. There were scratch marks all around the door handle and huge chunks of wood had been ripped off. Then I heard it, that same guttural noise like someone choking on water. It whispered. Whatever I had encountered on that Friday night, it was stood at the top of the stairs wearing my landlady's nightgown. Its disfigured face was obscured by the dark, and its pale hands were draped over my housemate's chest as he gaped at me in fear. I will never forget his face, contorted in sheer agony. As I squinted in the darkness, I could see the nightgown billowing out from behind my housemate. I could see it, hanging inches off the floor. There, in the corridor, clutching my housemate, whatever this thing was, it was floating in the air. I immediately shouted to my boyfriend to pass me the flashlight, and I shone it directly at them both. It let out a piercing shriek and slithered back into the blackness of the upper hallway, dragging my housemate with it. In that brief flicker of light, I saw its face. This was no homeless person. This was not even close to being human. Its luminously pale skin, tinted with shades of blue, its long black hair draped like thick weeds across its back, its eyes like balls of fire, its mouth a twisted mass of bare white teeth and raw red flesh. That claw wrapped around my housemate's chest. I backed out of the house just in time to hear the sirens. After failing to connect with my housemate's phone and after reading the case notes, the dispatcher had decided to send officers to the address after all. The rest of what happened feels like a blur. I heard the officers rush past me, batons raised and powerful flashlights at the ready. They combed the house for my housemate and that thing, but found no one. All I remember after that is sitting on the pavement, clutching a cup of tea with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. I wasn't cold, but I couldn't stop shivering. I couldn't even find the strength to cry. The officer who I had spoken to on Saturday finally showed up at around 8 p.m. and approached me. He told me that they'd sent officers to the house on Saturday evening and that these officers had encountered my other 18-year-old housemate. They'd searched the house and found nothing, so they naturally assumed that whoever had broken in had already stolen what they wanted and left. Apparently, they had advised my 18-year-old housemate to get anything of value from my room and the New Zealand housemate's room and lock it in his room in case the perpetrator came back. Then they left and no one has heard from the kid since. He wasn't there when they checked the house today, and there's no sign that he packed a bag to leave. I've only just gotten back to my boyfriend's house and my head is a mess. With the officer's help, I was able to retrieve some of my belongings from the house, but it's a small comfort. I can't get the image of that thing out of my head. What happened to my housemates, and why didn't the police find anything? I have to believe that whatever the thing is, it's still there and it's hiding them somewhere. I have to help them somehow. I have a confession to make. I wasn't telling the entire truth. I have covered up certain facts that now I'm beginning to realize are integral to getting myself out of this situation. I have dreamt of that haunting figure in my old house since the incident on Sunday, and I can't keep quiet any longer. In order to really explain why I lied, I need to give some background on my relationship with my landlady. When I first moved in last year, we were on good terms and maintained a friendly relationship until this year. In that time, I got to know a bit about my landlady and her background. As far as I know, she's never married and has no children, but she has 2 brothers and a sister who all still live in China. she's always been very secretive about why she moved to UK alone, so I never pressed the issue. From what I can gather, her extended family are quite poor and she regularly sends money back to them. At the start of the year, she confided in me that one of her grandnephews had been diagnosed with leukemia and the family was struggling to keep up with the medical bills. She then immediately told me that she'd be raising the rent quite substantially because she needed to send more money back to help with the grandnephew's treatment. Since my room was the largest one in the house, I was going to be the hardest hit. I was immediately skeptical about the story surrounding her grandnephew, particularly since it came right before the conversation about the rent. I thought it was a sob story she could use as an excuse to hike up our rent and make a tidy profit. I told her categorically that I couldn't afford it, and this understandably caused a rift between us. Our relationship degenerated quickly during the first few weeks of January and eventually devolved to us having loud arguments in the hallway whenever we crossed paths. She was afraid that I would become a squatter, and I, in turn, was afraid that she would turf me out at last minute, leaving me with no place to live. The situation escalated past the point of reconciliation. This is the point where the real story diverges from what I originally told. I was not innocuously asking if my boyfriend could stay over, nor was I the first one to initiate contact. On that Thursday, someone at work had clearly tampered with my landlady's lunch or eaten it, because I got a text from her around 3 p.m. saying, "Where's my lunch? You think it's funny?" I replied telling her that I hadn't done anything to her food, but she didn't believe me and kept accusing me of lying. The conversation devolved into her calling me some expletives, and I returned the favor. This texting spree spanned several hours since she was at work and was only checking her phone intermittently. By about 6 p.m., she finally sent her ultimatum. In her words, "You pay the higher rent cost or you get out of my house tonight." I was overcome with mixture of anger and panic. It was in weird haze of emotion that I said something now I deeply regret. What's the point in paying so much for all this treatment if your grandnephew is just going to die anyway? I shuddered with contempt, disgusted with myself for saying something so heinous, but equally inflated with a sense of self-righteousness against my money-grubbing landlady. Everything I said about the storm was true, and when my landlady called me around 7 p.m., suddenly vibration of my phone did startle me. I was reluctant to pick up the phone as I knew I was in the wrong, but I was still a mess of fear and rage. I answered the phone to a cacophony of abuse from my understandably outraged landlady. But rather than concede, I decided to argue back. It is not something I am proud of. She must have been on her way to her car because I could hear the rain in the background and heavy sound of her footsteps. We must have been arguing for about 10 minutes before she had suddenly paused. There was a sharp intake of breath. Then I heard her get hit by the car. I heard her scream, heard the crunch of her bones under the wheel and the screech of tires as the driver tore away from the scene. I heard her weeping and begging for help, her cries smothered by a torrent of raindrops, and I hung up on her. I had no idea where she was or what to do, but I felt somehow that I might be implicated in the accident or she would find some way to blame me. So I went back to the computer, I put my headphones on, and I kept right on working. It was until about 9 p.m. that I finally mustered up the courage to send her a text reading, "Are you all right?" From then on, the story is the same. The creepy responses, the scratching on my door, the menacing whispers, all of that was true. Deep down, I knew she was dead long before the police officer told me. I knew from the moment I hung up on that phone, and I know that she will never leave me alone. I thought that offering up my housemates might help, but it hasn't.